Welcome to We Can Be, a podcast brought to you by the Heinz Endowments. I'm your host, Chris DeCardy. Today's guest is Marques Redd, a celebrated multimedia artist, independent scholar, traditional African cosmologist, and co-founder of the nonprofit Rainbow Serpent. Rainbow Serpent has a mission to shine light on the Black LGBTQ culture through film, art, cosmology, and emerging technologies, and has made an impressive impact across the U.S. and, in fact, cities around the world in a short few years. Marques is a film director, a choreographer, a composer, and a respected writer whose topics have included jazz musician Sun Ra, novelist Ishmael Reed, and art collective Women of Visions. I can't wait to talk to him about his vision of our world. Marques Redd, welcome to We Can Be.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
For those who are not familiar with it, in downtown Pittsburgh, in the heart of the cultural district, when you are at the intersection of 7th and Penn Avenue, there is this enormous 1,200 square foot art installation that is on the back of the Symphony Hall, and it is yours. Tell me a little bit about what it is and why is it there?
That piece is called Playing the Cosmic Strings. It was a commission by the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra because they wanted a piece that would celebrate 70 years of them being in Heinz Hall. Working with Michael Awuna, who is a frequent collaborator of mine, we decided to dig into the archive of Afro-diasporic myth to try to think about what is the origin of music from a traditional African perspective. And we came across this story about a cosmic spider who spins these infinite strings of energy. Those strings of energy were so interesting because on one hand, they represent all of the strings that form the foundation and the structure of the world, but they also speak to the vibrational energies that are surrounding us at all times. These connections that join all of us together, that really talk about how we're immersed into the world, always being affected by it and always affecting the world. And it seemed to be such a great piece that would fit with the symphony, particularly because so many of those are stringed instruments that are being played to also consciously give us music and harmonic vibrations. And so we worked on this piece, which basically features me as the protagonist of this cosmic spider. And you see me reaching through this string almost as if I'm about to reach out and grab people passing by on the street.
What I love about it, and I think one of the things that's interesting to explore about your work, is going in two directions. And that is this deep connection to a past, to cosmology and myth, but then this throughput to a future using technology, using new ways of expression that have only been made available in the last couple of decades in this mix. And it's all right there in that one installation. Talk a little bit about the historical piece. What's important to you, and why was it important to you as an artist to deeply explore that cosmology from Africa? And in this particular piece, where is it from, and how do you pull that through in your work?
That's a great question. So this particular narrative comes from the Igbo tradition, and the Igbo cultural group is located in southeastern Nigeria. Mikel and I, all the work that we've created, we draw on a lot of different cultural contexts from ancient Egypt and different West African contexts. So not only Igbo, but also Yoruba, was also from Nigeria, Dogon from Mali. And so this particular narrative from the Igbo tradition was especially important because Mikel's family history is very connected to that cultural group. They are Igbo. And so part of that was thinking about how to explore his family connections, his autobiography, thinking about what those particular traditions might mean for contemporary context. And as an African-American person, I've always been interested in thinking about how to reconnect contemporary African-American cultures with some of our West African forebears as well. How do we not only excavate those traditions, but modernize them and make them available for contemporary use? I think it's important to bring narratives with different kinds of worldviews or cosmological standpoints into our frame of reference.
So those two seem to be these anchoring aspects of what you are about. You've also said that it's important in this mix to center and focus on this intersection of Black and LGBTQIA experience. And so bring that into that mix and the stories that you were telling, and why is it important to come from that perspective as you're linking to this past and to that future as you think about what's animating your work?
Thinking about the contemporary Black LGBT community, I would say that we've been a community under attack.
Tonight, Florida's controversial legislation, dubbed by critics as the Don't Say Gay bill and gaining national attention, has been sent to Governor Ron DeSantis to sign, the governor already signaling he supports it, despite days of protests from the LGBTQ community and thousands of students.
Within the last year alone, there have been over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in legislatures around the country. And of course, we're always under the shadow of racial violence. So one part of our mission was thinking about how do we create a new kind of cultural space for the Black LGBTQ community? How do we think about our value in the world? How do we think about reviving some of our cultural traditions that have been marginalized, erased, or suppressed? And so I would say one of the major projects that we just worked on was called Myth, Science, The Gatekeepers, which was a collection of 16 glass sculptures of these Black, queer, ancient Egyptian deities that was on display for 3 months at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. And one figure for that exhibition was called Hapi. We have images of this figure from at least 1800 BC, and even though he was represented as a man, he also was represented with large breasts and a pregnant stomach. And so we can think of this figure really as the first androgynous deity of human history. The project was asking, what would it mean to take a figure like this, that's thousands of years old, and bring it into our current environment to say, okay, well, we have these traditions where queer people are associated with the divine, where there were different understandings of gender and gender expression, and how can we derive a sense of power, a sense of community, a sense of strength from these ancient prototypes that have been lost or forgotten.
We have place, we have history, we have meaning,
Exactly.
We belong.
Exactly.
We're not a construct of some moment.
Or an anomaly, or
right.
just an aberration
Right.
with no place or with no history.
You've had now exhibitions all over the country. You've got dance, you've got video, you've got these sculptures. What has the receptivity been like? What are you learning or taking away from these exhibits in these different places? And what does this start to mean for you as you think about your form of expression and where this is moving?
So I would say the first question, what has been the reception? Oh, it's been, amazing, really. Even just sticking with this glass sculpture project, and we've had the opportunity to present it to many different kinds of audiences. So on one hand, we have presented it to professional Egyptologists, because there was a national Egyptology conference that happened to take place in Pittsburgh, and people were shocked to see how cultural dynamics that were 3,000 years old, or older in some cases, were being reanimated or rethought or given new life in such a vivid way. We've had a chance to present the work to people, of course, in the contemporary art space, to see the technical innovations of how we are pushing these mediums into new formats. Many of the hairstyles that accompanied the deities in this project had never been sculpted in glass before. So there was an intense work that had to be done, even just to figure out technically how to create box braids or a high top fade. And we've also had a chance to present the work to people in the public health space, because we know Black LGBTQ people have had very negative experiences with mental health. We know those kinds of health disparities, and people have seen this kind of work as a new venue to think about cultivating self-esteem, or thinking about ways to engage with spirituality and meditation in different ways. So I think people have been coming into the work from such vastly different angles, and it's been great to see how we've been able to touch so many people. And actually, the show closed this past weekend, and I saw someone who was on a video call with someone who was incarcerated, and they were walking from statue to statue with their phone, showing the pieces, and I could see the person in the cell on the phone watching, and I could just see how touched he was. I mean, and it almost moved me to tears just to see how deeply the work was resonating and what it meant to such a vast variety of people.
Oh, that's a vivid story. Thank you for sharing that. So, Marques, with the exhibit and with these busts, as you just described them, something that comes through is how precise, almost scientific you are in thinking that through. And yet there's also something about them that is almost unique and spontaneous. I wonder if you could describe a little bit of how you think about those two things as you put together a project like this.
Each deity figure has its own unique color combination, and you'll see that in many different traditions around the continent where different deities are associated with different colors or combinations of colors. Each headpiece was made with whatever the color combination of that particular deity figure was, but then we would also take little bits of crushed glass of those colors and mix it in with the black for the bust. That is something that you cannot really predict in advance, because when you have something that's heated up to, let's say, 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, the medium will act on its own. And so that was one of the things that would actually surprise us, because each figure would have its own look, its own feel. I mean, one could say that the figures themselves chose how they wanted to be represented. Whatever happened in this kiln process as it was forming, it made its own mind as a medium how it wanted to come into the world, which I think we all kind of do in our own unique ways, and figuring out what talents we incarnate to share and to bring forward.
It's a wonderful segue into Rainbow Serpent. What is Rainbow Serpent?
Yeah, so Rainbow Serpent really is the institutional home in which all of this work is done. The organization is attempting to advance Black LGBTQ culture through exploring this mix of multimedia art, emerging tech, traditional African spirituality, and innovative healing methods. And as you were saying before, I mean, we've done a variety of work in different kinds of areas. I mean, so we've done live performances, photography projects, film projects, public art installations. We've worked in a lot of different media, and we've also done multi-day healing retreats where we engage with audiences and this artwork in a more embodied and immersive way. So I think our goal broadly is to bring these queer African spiritual traditions into the present, to really introduce as many audiences as we can to them, and to really find as many mediums as we can to translate this work into contemporary context.
How did you get inspired to be in this space to where you are right now?
So I'm originally from Macon, Georgia. Both of my parents were telecommunications engineers and worked at Bell South. But in their free time, they were art collectors, and they opened a gallery called Miracles Fine Art Gallery in 1990, which was the first institution of its kind in the Middle Georgia area to feature the work of Black artists. And so from a very early age, I grew up having to go to the gallery after school, having to go to the gallery on the weekend. And my parents, they would take pieces of art from their collection and travel to different churches or cultural centers to talk about art and really to be advocates for art. So I was used to helping them pack things up and getting in the car and sitting in the auditorium while they spoke. And I think they also had an activist spirit that inspired their work as well as collectors and gallerists. I mean, so my parents were born in the 50s in Georgia, so right at the end of the Jim Crow era. For them, I think art and art collecting was a deep cultural work. I mean, it was a way to capture history. It was a way to teach history. It was a way to instill a certain kind of cultural pride, a way to organize communities, and a way to help people elevate their understanding and their skill levels. So I think that inspiration of using art as a cultural medium was something that was ingrained to me at a very early age.
So you mentioned that they were born sort of at the end of Jim Crow, but that was not the end of violence, oppression, prejudice, hatred. It certainly goes through to today. Were there impacts or repercussions from their activism that you saw directly or indirectly that influenced you in any kind of way?
That's a great question. I would say that they instilled in me a knowledge really of how to stand up for myself and how to assert myself. My father, in particular, went to the first high school class that was integrated in Macon, Georgia. And so there were so many conflicts around even whether they would allow Black students to come to the graduation. So even though it was an integrated class, there were still ways in which people were trying to reconstruct or bring back segregation in different ways.
Right.
I mean, and constantly, because he was elected as the president of the student government, I mean, he was constantly having confrontations at the newspaper or constantly having confrontations with the sheriff's office. And so there are so many stories about moments where people were trying to, again, just fight for space, just fight to be able to participate in institutions of society.
And be seen and
exactly.
And have that
And so
space.
I think all of those stories have just stuck with me and really influenced how I move through the world.
So you clearly talked about the connection to art and that exposure, and you've talked about standing up for yourself and having that. You have those pieces. Where were you going to go, and what started to turn for you to land where you are now?
Yeah, so before this iteration of life, I was in higher education. Mm-hmm. And so I was a professor of English literature and taught for several years at Marquette University. I spent some time also at Texas State University and University of Notre Dame in Indiana. So after a career as a professor, I also spent some time as a higher ed administrator. In Pittsburgh, I was the director of graduate advising for the University of Pittsburgh. The pandemic pushed me into a different direction. You know, just like all of us, we were forced to stay in the house. We had to rethink our lives. So it all started actually with a book club that Mikkel Owuna and I created that was really a space for Black LGBTQ people to come together to read about different African traditions and think about what traditional African spirituality could mean for our community. We found these stories that we were inspired by or things that we wanted to pursue further. One narrative was about these two androgynous deities who create the world through dance, also coming from the Igbo tradition. And so we decided that we would make a short film about it. We worked with two dancers who had been working with the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, Corey Bourbonnier and Victoria Watford, and we did it. Not necessarily expecting that it would lead to anything, actually. But when we finished the film in 2021, we were invited to screen it at Clamp Art Gallery in New York, and then started to get more invitations to come to many different places around the country, from the Esalen Institute in California to the North Carolina Museum of Art. And things really took off from there. And after about a year, I made the decision to pursue it more seriously and full time.
So, Marcus, in each of our conversations, we invite a guest to ask a question from their perspective. This seems like the right moment to invite our guest questioner this time for you.
Hi, Marcus. Surprise! This is multimedia artist, filmmaker, engineer, and president of the City of Pittsburgh's Public Art and Civic Design Commission, Mikkel Owuna. And as you know all too well, I am also the co-founder of our nonprofit art organization, Rainbow Serpent. I love the depth, good energy, and beauty you bring to your art. And my question for you is this. One part of your background that plays a key part in your art and in much of Rainbow Serpent's work is your study of cosmology. What first sparked that interest, and why is it so meaningful to you?
Wow. Okay. So the question is, what does cosmology mean to me? Yeah, sometimes it seems like the easiest questions are the hardest. I've been in this space for so long and working in this area at least 20 years at this point, such that it becomes hard to remember the exact point at which I started down this path. I would, if I had to pinpoint a certain time, it probably would go back to being in middle school, going to the public library in Macon, Georgia, and seeing some of the large coffee table books of ancient Egypt and seeing the massive pyramids and the temples and the hieroglyphics and just being enthralled with such aesthetic splendor and intellectual complexity and just sheer beauty. And I would say that put into conversation with the art that I was surrounded by as a child really pushed me in this direction. If I had to define cosmology, or what is African cosmology in particular, I would say that it is really a form of knowledge that seeks to provide a full map for people, a map that connects everything from the creation of the world down to our everyday life, that thinks about creation not just on the macrocosmic level of where did the universe come from, but creation also in the personal sense of how do I create a life filled with divine harmony. So if I had to give an example, I would turn to one of the figures that we sculpted or that we represented in our sculpture project. So this figure, Mahus, this lion-headed deity. On one level, biologically, we could say this figure represents the immune system and how the body fights against invasion, against bacteria, against viruses. Psychologically, one could say this lion-headed war figure represents the courage that it takes to come out, the fight that it takes to live one's authentic life and one's authentic truth. Sociologically or communally, I would say this figure represents the power of being able to stand up and fight against bullying or anti-LGBTQ discrimination. The power of traditional African knowledge systems is that it helps you to think about how these energetic forces appear and manifest in all of these different domains simultaneously, and gives you a map for spiritual development and a mode of understanding the world in which we live.
That was super cool. I'm really glad that he asked that question of you in that mix, and that's beautiful. That knits it all together really well. Your work is so dependent on collaboration, and it feels like it's built into what you're doing. I'm curious about what works best for you in a collaboration and how you think about bringing out the best of others in that collaboration.
We are very interested in creating a new conceptual universe, a new visual universe, a new intellectual spiritual universe. I mean, we are very specific in our mission of reviving ancient traditions that have been erased, marginalized, or lost to history. And because that vision is so clear, I think it provides a space for people to come into the work, find themselves in the work, and figure out what pieces they can contribute to it or ways in which they can elaborate it with their own particular skills and gifts. So I think part of what we're trying to do is not just create standalone objects, but create experiences, create spaces, and to create infrastructure for a larger kind of community development. So we're hoping that this work will actually have a real-world impact and that people will think about the world differently or live their life differently or contribute to the world differently.
So much of what you've talked about is being seen and being anchored at this intersection of the Black and LGBTQ experience, and keep on coming back to this cosmology, this myths, these origin stories which come through, and then the promise and the opportunity of new technology in this. How do you think about, or do you think about, your audience, and how much is creating space for folks that do identify in that way to be able to come in and be part of it, and how much of it is to be able to create an opening or a bridge to folks that actually don't share that lens or that identity to be able to create understanding. Are both in play for you, or how do you see your role as an artist in that mix?
I do think both are in play, and I think the work has a different impact for different audiences, but I do think the work is necessary for different audiences. So I do think we're constantly thinking about how we're reaching different groups of people, even with the same work. And I think that's a lot of the inspiration behind much of the public art installations. These are large-scale projects seen by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. And so I think we're giving new images of what the divine can look like, new images of what our connection with the larger cosmos can look like. Public work does have a psychic impact. It has a subtle kind of influence over people that might pass it or engage with it in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of art, right, visual performing art, is in that expression is to reach people at a deeply emotional level, and emotion driving changes in perspective, understanding.
Yeah, and I would say, and that's an important part of the work that we do with our retreats as well. You know, let's say everyone knows yoga. I mean, when people think about these major spiritual modalities, people know about maybe transcendental meditation. But when you mention the topic of African spirituality, quite often you draw a blank from people. Yeah. And so I think it's important to introduce different publics to this topic of African spirituality. These are major traditions that have been a major part of the development of our species. I mean, these traditions are connected to some of the fundamental dynamics that make us human beings. And what does it mean that they're not a part of our everyday cultural lingo? We are advocating for these traditions and trying to serve as a mouthpiece to let people know, hey, there are some really interesting resources here that can expand consciousness or provide new perspectives that should be a part of your everyday repertoire.
What's that like to go through a retreat? Have you seen somebody go through the retreat, come out of that retreat, make the connections that you just described?
One of the interesting things about the retreats that we do is that they're based in our artwork. I mean, so one retreat might start with a screening of one of our films, and then we engage in activities collaboratively that are based on different scenes from the film. A retreat might entail certain forms of body painting, placing symbols on the body as a mode of focusing consciousness and supporting meditation and meditative practices. We might engage in certain forms of ritual dance and movement, and thinking about ways in which holding the body in certain ways provides access to insight and spiritual power. It's really a holistic, multidisciplinary, interactive, immersive way to explore some of the issues that we present in the artwork, and gives people a different way to experience and embody that work. And I mean, we've gotten all kinds of feedback. I mean, people gaining certain clarity about their relationship with their ancestors, thinking about their own fundamental spiritual purpose. These kinds of retreats do open up spaces and insights for people in a variety of ways.
I'm so grateful for this, just getting out of my comfort zone, some of it too.
I just feel fortunate, and I feel like I have tools now on how to invoke things in my life that I want to, and in a framework, of how to think about transformation.
I think that I've learned a lot that was full of connection and practice and little seeds of ideas that have infinite possibility if we open our minds up to what's available.
Rainbow Serpent, you described this, right, is sort of taken off. What is next on your horizon? Where are you challenging yourself? What's on your mind to create?
One project that we're working on is transforming the Four World Ages, which was our live performance project that premiered last year, into a film. We developed a spatial augmented reality system that used motion capture and AI to follow the bodies of dancers and project images and symbols onto them in real time. And we also had a series of projections behind them that they danced in front of. They were portraying this particular narrative from the Igbo cultural context, again, about the development of human history from this early age of divine unity, where we were all directly connected to the Creator, to our contemporary age of chaos, which, I mean, you only need to look at the daily news to see that that's an accurate description of where we are.
For sure.
So we filmed a lot during the rehearsals leading up to that live performance. And so we're thinking about how to take that footage, blend it with some new AI digital techniques to create a version of that in-person live experience through the medium of film. So that's one piece that we're working on. And we're also working on a mural that will be a tribute to Pittsburgh icon Martin Delaney, the first African-American Union Army officer, Pittsburgh-based, also a journalist, started the newspaper The Mystery here, often called the father of Black nationalism, the first African-American to decipher the hieroglyphics. So we're thinking about a mural that is a tribute to him and to Pittsburgh history that will hopefully be out within the next year. As I mentioned, we also had an immersive VR film that we would like to also expand and make into a VR headset experience so that people can walk around this temple space, interact directly with these deities, this intersection between art, tech, and healing protocols. And I think that project would bring all of the different planks of our mission together. So yeah, wide variety of things we're excited about.
I have a question for you around activism, potentially in this mix. Do you see yourself, you've talked about it, as an activist? And do you particularly think about those goals as you're developing pieces? Or what's the relationship?
I mean, I would say implicitly, of course, the work is so political,
right,
in the way in which it is raising questions around gender, sexuality, race, Blackness. I do think there is continued space for us to contribute to these issues, actually not even just here, but around the continent as well. I mean, we have seen all kinds of draconian legislation passed in countries like Uganda and Ghana, places where homosexuality, even just mentioning the word, is criminalized. I do think we have a lot of work that we're hoping to do in that space here and around other countries in Europe and the Caribbean. Even at the very beginning of our work, we were very interested in these questions around political asylum, how to create safe spaces for people, how to provide spaces, physical and digital, for people to organize, and also advocacy for spreading stories and impact of harmful systems around the world and being a voice for people. And I do think our organization, as we continue to grow, and we've only been around as a 501c3 for 1 year. So I feel like we're still very, very young in our development. But we're very excited, though, to be on the front lines of those questions around how to create safe spaces for people and how to create situations and places where people are able to live their fullest lives.
That in of itself often is activism and is often dangerous for people. One of the things, back full circle in our conversation, is that anchoring in a history, anchoring in a past that is deeply rooted, that is not created and pulled out of whole cloth or is somehow something in a moment that people could be ignored or dismissed. But to say that I have a particular identity and I have a place and I belong, just saying that can be dangerous for people in so many ways.
Well, and especially for an organization that does so much public work. I mean, our work is, or can be often quite contested. And we've had, I wouldn't say backlash, but I would say that there are very intense conversations around people questioning whether our work belongs in certain places or should be displayed in certain ways. We're constantly having those kinds of debates that really, I think, not necessarily define how we create art, but define how we're thinking around how to portray it and create space for it.
So, Marques, the name of our podcast is We Can Be. What do you believe we, our city, our country, our world, can be?
We can be our highest divine selves.
That's beautiful. Thank you for the time today. Thank you for what you are bringing to the world. It is unique and it is important, and we are delighted that we can play a small part in supporting it.